Did you know that the question, how much hay does my horse need, is one of the most common questions asked of horse nutritionists all around the world, and one of the biggest worries horse owners have when it comes to feeding their horses? And with really good reason, because if you don't feed enough hay, you'll cause all sorts of issues, including weight loss and weird dental wear patterns right through to deadly colic. So it's a super important aspect of your horse's nutrition to get right, and it is the topic of today's conversation. So hey there, it is Dr. Nerida, and you are on the Happy Horse Nutrition Podcast, and we are going to be talking about how much hay you should be feeding your horses on a daily basis. It is one of the most common concerns for horse owners, and it is for really good reason, because if you get it wrong, it does have serious and, as I've already mentioned, even deadly consequences. So I am a big advocate for high forage diets for all horses. So for everything from your pony club kids mount right through to high performance race horses, they all will thrive when you feed them a high forage diet. And it's because horses have been evolving for 55 million years, and over that 55 million years, they have evolved to eat high forage diets. And we stumbled into their lives about 4,500 years ago, which is a mere 0.01% of their time on this earth. And all of a sudden, we want to change the way that they're fed. And we'll introduce things like cereal grains, which were never a major part of a horse's diet. And as a consequence of doing that, we'll often feed a lot less forage than what their gut is designed to handle on a daily basis. Essentially, what I'm going to talk about today is how we, instead of trying to adapt the horse to us and what suits us, we need to adapt our feeding programs to suit the horse. And if we can do that, then we get the best health and performance outcomes for all types of horses. So let's just talk about for a second, what are the consequences of not feeding enough hay in a horse's diet? And there are many. So the first one that always comes to my mind when I think about not feeding enough hay, and I'm talking here about horses that are reliant on hay. So either they're on very overgrazed pastures, or they're in yards or dry lots or stables, barns that don't allow them free access to pasture. So they're not able to go and actually self-select the amount of forage that they'll eat in the day. And they're at the mercy of their human. So they're at your mercy with regards to how much forage they're actually being fed per day. So the most serious consequence, and the one that comes to my mind first when I think about horses not being fed enough hay, is colic. So a horse's gut is huge. I talk about the horse's gastrointestinal tract in, I think it's podcast number 2, one of the very early podcasts, if you'd like to go back and have a listen in detail about the structure of their gastrointestinal tract. But their large intestine, which we collectively call the hindgut, so it's made up of the cecum and the colon, and we call it the hindgut, is a massive structure. I'm a pretty average height person, and if I took the cecum of a 500 kilogram horse and held it up to me, it would be from about my hip height down to the ground. So it's a huge structure. And then the colon, roughly twice that size. And if we don't keep that filled up with forage, it tends to collapse and twist around and end up in places that it shouldn't end up. And then you get a severe case of colic that will often require surgery to be resolved successfully. And obviously, if it's not resolved successfully, then it will result either in the horse dying if it's not under medical attention, or having to be euthanized because the colic is so severe. So it's super important that we keep that big gut of theirs filled up with forage, so that they can keep all of the various bits and pieces of their gut in the right place, and we don't get any of these twists and turns that will result in what will be deadly colic if it's not resolved. The second issue that springs to mind, because I'm such a lover of the microbes that living in our horse's gut, and they play so many important roles for our horse's health. They control everything from their feed digestion right through to their immune response and their gut-brain axis communication, which then flows on to being very much in control of your horse's behaviour. If we don't feed enough hay, we're essentially starving the good microbes in the hindgut. So the good microbes, so there's bacteria and fungi in the hindgut. that help the horse digest the fibre. Well, they do digest the fibre. They do the whole process of fibre digestion for your horse. And they also produce vitamins and they produce hormones, and they help to maintain the health of the lining of the gastrointestinal tract. They've got so many important roles, but they live on fibre. It's their favourite food, and it is what keeps their population strong and healthy. So if you're not feeding enough hay, you're essentially starving a lot of those bacteria and fungi, and then their populations will decline. So your horse doesn't have the sheer number of bacteria and fungi that it would normally have in a healthy gut if it was being fed enough hay. And then you'll get flow-on negative effects of having less microbes in their hindgut than what they should. Another huge issue and very important issue with not feeding enough hay is that your horse will spend less time chewing, and their stomach will spend more time being empty on diets that don't provide enough hay. So hay is super important for encouraging chewing. It takes a lot of chewing hay, so it's brilliant stuff. And the reason chewing is so important is because when they chew, they produce saliva. And that saliva goes into the stomach, and then it dilutes and buffers the hydrochloric acid that is naturally being produced in your horse's stomach. Now, if you don't feed enough hay and they chew less, it means that you've got less saliva production. You've got less dilution and buffering of the hydrochloric acid in the stomach, which means that you'll have a lower pH. So it will be more acidic in the stomach than it should be if horses were eating proper amounts of hay. And then you combine that with the fact that if they have too small amounts of hay a day, they're not being fed enough hay each day, their stomach will also be empty for a lot longer than if they were being fed enough hay. Because the hay functions to fill the stomach up and keep it full of fibre. And then that fiber's role in the stomach is to stop the acid that is produced down the bottom section of the stomach. It stops that acid from splashing or being squeezed up to the top part of the stomach. And that's really important because the top part of the stomach actually doesn't have any natural protection from acid. So if the acid gets up there, it will literally just burn holes through your horse's stomach wall and create squamous gastric ulceration. So your horse will end up with gastric ulcers when you don't feed enough hay in their diet because they're not producing enough saliva and their stomach is being left to empty out for periods of time when there's not enough hay in the diet. You will also see dental issues. I had a really interesting case, it was years ago now, but a really interesting case it was a thoroughbred farm, and they were finding that their weanlings and yearlings had really odd dental wear patterns. So they were mainly seeing it in their yearlings. And the dentist was very concerned. The dentist for the farm was very concerned because the yearlings had all of these funny wear patterns on their teeth. And they were feeding at the time a feed that was an extruded cube, and it was a reasonably large extruded cube. And the thinking of the farm was that maybe because the extruded cube is quite large, it's causing these funny chewing patterns with the yearlings. But what it turned out to be when I really dug into it was they were feeding these yearlings way too much feed, hard feed, so concentrate, these extruded cubes, which meant that they weren't feeding enough hay. And it was a farm that didn't have a lot of pasture, particularly over the summer period. So the horses were reliant on hay as opposed to pasture for their forage. And when I had them adjust their diet so that they were feeding much less of the concentrate feed and a lot more hay, all those dental wear patterns corrected themselves. So the hay, because it's very high in silica and it's quite abrasive, when horses chew on hay, it wears their teeth down. Whereas when they chew on much softer hard feeds, concentrate feeds, grain-based feeds, we call them all sorts of different things all over the world. So great, this is a grain-based concentrate feed. They're a lot softer, and when they chew them, they don't need to chew them very much, so they don't actually get the correct wear pattern on their teeth. So it wasn't so much a problem of chewing soft hard feed as just simply not chewing enough hay in the diet. And when we got those young horses to chew enough hay, their dental wear patterns went completely back to normal. So if your horse is not getting enough hay, it is possible that you will start to see dental issues because they're not wearing their teeth down. And because horses evolved on such abrasive, high silica diets, their teeth grow constantly. So it is really, really important that we give them enough hay and enough access to forage so that they can chew a lot and wear their teeth down normally to fit that normal pattern of teeth wear that they've evolved over so many years to have, so that they don't run out of tooth, essentially. It's a brilliant design, but it's one of those things that when we change their diet too far away from what their natural diet is, we start to create issues. Another big issue, and this is a really unseen one, it's not well understood in horses, but it's certainly well understood in feedlot cattle and other animal species, is that when we create psychological stress through feed deprivation, so any time your horse doesn't have access to hay or any other feed to chew on, it's a state of feed deprivation. And that creates what we know as psychological stress. And then psychological stress leads to leaky gut. So your horse's gut will no longer function properly. And there's little structures that we call tight junctions in the gut that function to stop bacteria and pathogens and toxins and other muck in your horse's gut from actually getting out of the gut and escaping into your horse's body. But when your horse is in a state of psychological stress, their gut will start leaking, and it will leak muck into your horse's body, and then that will set up systemic inflammation. And then inflammation, this is particularly important if you've got performance horses, inflammation and the immune response is really energy hungry, and it will go after your horse's glycogen supplies. So the energy that they've got stored in the muscles, that's what the immune system will go after. So if you've got a performance horse, something like an eventer or an endurance horse, polo horse, thoroughbred racehorse, something that's quite reliant on their muscle glycogen supplies, if you've got those horses in a situation where they're not being fed enough hay, they're experiencing psychological stress, their gut will start leaking, their immune system will get switched on, and the immune system will chew up a lot of that muscle energy supply that they had stored away, which means you will get really poor performance because they simply don't have the muscle glycogen levels there to support their best performances. So it's an important one. It's also just an important one for a mental health perspective. We don't want our horses to be psychologically stressed. They are wired to chew, absolutely wired to chew. And it's their evolutionary process over so many years because they were free roaming animals. They were never, ever locked up in yards or stables and restricted from having access to something to chew. And you will see, I don't know how to put it into words without using too strong a language, but it actually physically hurts to see horses that are in yards or stables without hay and just seeing them chewing all of the timber rails that might be around, or chewing away at trees because they need something to chew. They want something to chew. And also too, I'm quite convinced that horses know when their stomach is getting too acidic and they want to go and chew on something so that they can produce some saliva and reduce that acidity in the stomach to reduce the burning, the acid burning in their stomach. So it's so important to feed your horse enough hay and to make sure that hay is always available so that they don't get into that state of feed deprivation and state of psychological stress. So linked to that as well is behavioural problems. So when horses don't have enough hay, you will start to see behavioural problems. So things like crib biting, wind sucking, and weaving and chewing on things that they wouldn't normally chew on. Different behaviours. Some are to satisfy their urge to chew. Some are just to alleviate boredom. They're meant to be out looking for food pretty much 24/7. They don't eat 24 hours a day, obviously, but they'll eat for about 18 hours a day if left to their own devices. And so when we confine them and don't give them enough hay, all of a sudden they've got nothing to do, so they've got no food to go searching for and they've got no food to chew on. So that typically will lead to behavioural problems, and you don't ever want to see those behavioural problems or experience those behavioural problems in your horse. And if you feed enough hay, it's a big step towards preventing horses from developing those types of behavioural issues. You will, of course, get weight loss if you don't feed enough hay. And there's a couple of avenues that this can happen. So sometimes it's just a matter of just not enough calories in the diet. So if you're not feeding enough hay, your horse is just not getting enough calories, or we also call it digestible energy in the diet, and they simply don't have enough energy to run their day-to-day metabolism and, provide energy for digesting food and moving around to find food and maintaining their body temperature, all of those things that burn up energy, even if they're not in work. And then if the horse is in work, of course, and you're not feeding enough hay, then they'll probably also lose weight because they're not getting enough energy to support that workload. This is a trap that you can unknowingly fall into. So horses are big animals and they need a lot of hay. So when you're feeding particularly large horses, horses that are well above 500 kilos or above 1,100 pounds, it's an extraordinarily large amount of hay that they eat on a daily basis. So if you're not confident with the amount of hay that you're feeding, or you're not weighing the amount of hay you're feeding, it is really easy to unknowingly underfeed them hay, and then that will cause weight loss. The other way that weight loss can occur when you're not feeding enough hay is if you're overcompensating by feeding grain. So the grain, and I will do a specific podcast on talking about whether horses need grain in their diet and how much grain should be fed. But if you feed too much grain, or if you feed the wrong type of grain, so if you're feeding raw cereal grains as opposed to well-cooked cereal grains, a lot of the starch that they contain will end up in the hindgut, and that starch will feed the bad bacteria, and the bad bacteria will produce lots of acid, and then that acid kills off your good fibre fermenting bacteria. And when those good fibre fermenting bacteria die off, your horse can no longer effectively digest the hay that they are getting, and then they will lose weight. So the weight loss can either be sheer lack of calories because you're simply not feeding enough, or it can be through reduced digestion because you've fed too much grain, and that grain is then negatively affecting the digestion of the hay that is in the diet, causing the horse to lose weight. Some other issues you will get with not enough hay in the diet are dehydration. So hay and forage in general acts as a sponge essentially in the hindgut. It will hang on to water for your horse until your horse needs it. So it'll hold a lot of water in the hindgut, and then when the horse's body needs water, it will suck that water out of the hindgut and into the body. So it's a beautiful water reserve, but if you're not feeding enough hay, then you have a proportionally decreased water reserve in their hindgut. You can have issues with cold stress. So the fermentation of hay in the hindgut is a huge source of heat for your horse. It's a big part of how they maintain their body temperature, particularly in very cold climates. So if you're not feeding them enough hay, it's kind of like turning off their heater, essentially. I had a really stark example of this in cattle, wasn't in horses, but cattle also rely on fermentation to keep them warm. So they have fermentation in their rumen and also in their hindgut. There was a big flood that went through some of the northern parts of Australia a number of years ago now, and lots of cattle unfortunately perished in the flood. But we visited a farm not long after that flood had gone through. And it was really interesting. They had a whole herd of these Brahman calves that were orphaned and potty reared. So they'd reared them after the flood, and the calves had survived, but their mothers had died, and I could not figure that out. And someone you would think that the calves would be much more susceptible to the cold, but they were okay, and their mothers actually died. And what they'd said to me at the time was that those cows hadn't had access to any kind of feed because everything was underwater, and therefore their rumens would have been empty, and they would not have been getting any heat from their rumen. And they're all Brahmins, so their bodies are designed to offload heat, so they would lose a lot of heat, particularly when they're wet for such a long period of time. And it was actually them dying, this is according to the farm that we were on, them dying from cold stress. But the calves would have been able to get milk from their mothers, and so they were okay, which that blew my mind. But it also was a really stark example of how important that heat is that is being generated through the process of fibre fermentation in the horse's hindgut for maintaining their body temperature and keeping them warm, particularly during really cold periods and particularly if it's cold, wet and windy. They really need that heat coming out of their hindgut. And cold stress has flow-on effects. So one of the flow-on effects with cold stress is also leaky gut. So you really want to avoid cold stress as much as possible. And the last negative impact I want to talk about with feeding not enough hay is on performance. So if you've got performance horses, hay is unbelievably important for their performance. So when I first started as a horse nutritionist back in the really early 2000s, and it was actually the year 2000, I was traipsing through 75 thoroughbred racing stables, weighing everything that these horses were fed. And I remember being quite horrified at how little hay was actually fed in these horses' diets. And lots of the trainers telling me that hay was really only fed as a filler. And that couldn't be further from the truth. So hay is a source of a really important source of energy for performance horses. And when it's fermented in the hindgut, the fungi and the bacteria that ferment the fibre in the hindgut produce a compound or multiple compounds called volatile fatty acids. And these volatile fatty acids are absorbed from the hindgut, and then your horse's muscles can use them to generate energy to provide movement. And as long as they can't use it in really intense exercise, but whenever the exercise is slow, so walking, trotting, cantering, and even early stages of galloping, they can use these volatile fatty acids as a source of energy. So if you've got a horse that has a healthy hindgut that is full of hay, then those bacteria and fungi are fermenting that fibre constantly, and those VFAs are flowing constantly from your horse's hindgut into their muscles, and then the horse's muscles can burn them to fuel exercise. So your horse's hindgut is like a fully charged battery when it's got lots of hay in it. And it will never, ever run out of energy as long as you keep it healthy and as long as you keep it full of fibre. Which means that for a performance horse, while they're travelling, while they're warming up, while they're in the less intense phases of exercise, they're using those volatile fatty acids from the hindgut and they are conserving their muscle glycogen. And when they can conserve their muscle glycogen for as long as possible, it means that it will take much, much longer for them to hit muscle fatigue because they'll have saved up their muscle glycogen levels. And the other performance benefit that hay provides, and in fact all foragers, so if your horse is on pasture, this all applies to you as well. The other benefit is that foragers are really high in potassium. And potassium is one of the most important minerals for buffering a horse's body fluids. And particularly in performance horses, when we can buffer their body fluid to be a higher pH, it gives them a performance advantage because when they do have to start burning glycogen in zero oxygen conditions, so when they're in really intense phases of exercise, galloping, jumping, spinning, turning, doing all of those things that mean that their muscles have to operate for a period of time without oxygen, they burn their muscle glycogen, but burning that muscle glycogen leads to the production of lactic acid. Eventually they'll produce so much lactic acid that that acid acidifies the muscles, and then it will actually shut down any further burning of glycogen, and that's when your horse will hit muscle fatigue. So potassium, that is really naturally rich in hay and pasture, all of these benefits apply to pasture as well. When you feed a high forage diet, feeding plenty of hay, you get lots of potassium in the diet, and then you get this natural buffering effect. So your horse's body pH increases and it gives them a higher lactic acid threshold. So it takes a lot longer for them to hit that point where the muscles are so acidic that the burning of glycogen under zero oxygen conditions actually shuts down, which means you extend the amount of time it takes them to hit fatigue. And that is such a performance advantage. For performance horses, I ask my guests on the interview podcast what's one myth about their particular area of expertise that they wish would disappear forever. And for me, in this space, the myth I wish would disappear forever is that hay is just a filler for performance horses. It is so much more. It is an incredibly useful and important source of energy, giving rise to those VFAs that are constantly flowing out of the hindgut. And it's incredibly important for muscle buffering so that your horses don't hit that lactic acid threshold too long. So it really is the secret weapon of performance horses, and the more forage you can get into a performance horse's diet, the better off they will be for all of the reasons that we've talked about. So reduce gastric ulcer risk, reduce risk of serious colic. They'll have very healthy microbopulation in their hindgut, which will then support proper immune function and proper behaviour. All of those things are really important, and they're all benefits that you'll get when you feed diets that have plenty of hay. So now we've talked about all of the things that can go wrong when you don't feed enough hay and some of the benefits you get when you do feed lots of hay. Let's talk about how much is enough hay. What are the actual numbers? So if you look in the published information, you will find that the current recommended minimum hay for horses is 1.5% of their body weight. So if you're talking kilograms, that means a 500 kilogram horse should be getting an absolute minimum of 7.5 kilograms per day. That's for all horses. So thoroughbred race horses, eventers, right through to your kids' pony club horse. Every horse, that's the absolute minimum of hay you should be feeding, is that 1.5% of body weight. If you speak in pounds, that is for an 1,100 pound horse, it's 16.5 pounds per day. Now, my ideal amount of hay that a horse should be fed per day is between 2 and 3% of their body weight per day. That's what I like to see horses getting in hay per day. So again, if you're speaking kilograms, for a 500 kilogram horse, that's 10 to 15 kilograms per day. Or if you're speaking pounds, for an 1,100 pound horse, that's 22 to 33 pounds of hay per day. There's another aspect of hay feeding that's really important. So it's one thing to feed enough hay, and it's another thing to make sure that your horse is eating that hay in a natural fashion over a 24-hour period. And what I mean by natural fashion is that they're chewing on that hay for as close to 18 hours of the day as possible, because that is how they've evolved to eat. They've evolved to eat for roughly 18 hours of the day. And so you want to extend the amount of time it takes them to eat their hay allocation every day. Because if you feed, say you have a 500 kilogram horse and you're feeding 2% of their body weight in hay per day, which is 10 kilograms of hay, that's the right amount of hay. You're feeding enough hay. But if you gave that horse who, let's say, was in a stable, if you gave that horse 5 kilograms of hay in the morning and 5 kilograms of hay in the evening, but within 2 hours of feeding it that hay, it had eaten all of its hay in the morning, and then 2 hours after you feed in the evening, all of the hay is gone as well. That means in a 24-hour period, it's only eating hay for 4 hours of the day. And it's got another 20 hours where it's standing around without hay to chew. Now that is going to give rise to most of the problems that not feeding enough hay will cause as well. So you've got long periods of time without chewing, which means you've got long periods of time without saliva production, and gastric acid production happens 24/7 in the horse's stomach. So when they're not chewing, they're not salivating, and then that acid will accumulate in the stomach, and there's no saliva to dilute and buffer it, and the pH in the stomach can drop as low as a pH of 1, which is the equivalent of battery acid, and it can do so much damage really quickly in the horse's stomach with causing squamous gastric ulceration. So we want to avoid these long periods of time without hay. With long periods of time without hay, you'll also have a stomach that is empty a lot of the time. So you combine that with the fact that it's got a highly acidic pool of acid sitting in the bottom of it. And without the fibre there to stop that acid from splashing or squeezing up to the top, the ulcer risk is increased again. You'll also have lots of the problems that we've already talked about with behaviour, because they don't have something to chew on, and they're absolutely wired to chew. And I am convinced that horses know and can feel when their stomach pH is getting too low, so when their stomach is becoming too acidic, and they'll start trying to find anything to chew on. I have even seen horses in stables without enough hay just chewing on their own tongue. just to generate, my theory is just to generate some saliva production to try and buffer the acid in their stomach. So it's really important that you not only provide the right amount of hay, but you also make sure that they're eating that hay over as much of a 24-hour period as possible. My preferred rule with this is that you don't allow horses to go any longer than 4 hours without hay to chew. Absolute hard rule is never, ever, ever let horses go for longer than 6 hours without hay to chew, because you will just put them at massively increased risk of gastric ulceration, behavioural problems. You'll get the psychological stress that we talked about when hay is not available. Then their gut will start leaking, set up inflammation, and that's a disaster for all horses, but particularly if you've got performance horses, it will really, really have a negative impact on their performance. So to spread hay out over a 24-hour period, so again, let's say you've got a 500 kilogram horse or an 1,100 pound horse if you speak in pounds, and you're feeding that 10 kilograms or 22 pounds of hay per day, you need to get a little bit creative in how you get your horse to extend the amount of time it takes them to eat that hay. So there's lots of hay bags, hay pillows, slow feeding hay nets, hay boxes, all kinds of wonderful contraptions that clever people have come up with over the years just to try and slow horses down with eating hay. Because when you think about it, they're grazing animals, and they never found in the wild, they would never find just a big clump of grass, a big pile of grass all in one spot already cut for them, and essentially being able to just pick it up and eat it. They had to search for their pasture or their forage, sometimes over massive distances. So they would eat small amounts constantly as they moved around and grazed along. But they can eat hay so much faster because it's right there in front of them. And they don't even have to shear it off with their front teeth. They just pick it up with their lips and it's already in their mouth. So we need to be creative in how we slow our horses down. Do use some sort of slow feeding system if your horse does eat its hay very, very quickly and leaves itself for longer than 4 hours without hay to chew. I have a pony here, Spotty the pony, who's not Spotty. And she is in a paddock at the moment that is well eaten down, but the next pasture that she's due to go into is not ready for her yet, and I don't want to move her too soon, so I'm just sort of holding her off in the paddock that she's currently in. But there's not enough pasture in there for her anymore. There's enough to pick around and nibble on during the day, but there's not enough to meet her nutrient needs, so I've been giving her hay. I was being lazy the other day and I just threw a piece of hay over the fence to her. And she ate it in no time at all. And then yesterday, knowing that I was going to record this podcast today, I put the hay in a slow feeding hay pillow and paid a lot more attention to how long it took her to eat that hay. And she was nibbling at that hay bag for 4 to 5 hours. It was there for a long, long time. So it does really extend the amount of time it takes them to eat hay. It makes, for me, it makes eating that hay much more natural. So they're eating small amounts over a longer period of time, which is much more like what they would do if they were grazing. And it just means that you avoid these extended periods of time that will cause gastric ulceration, behavioural issues, psychological stress, all of the things that we've talked about. It will mean that you avoid all of those issues for your horse. There's not really such a thing as too much hay. You won't hurt your horse by feeding too much hay, but what you will do, your horse will be very, very happy if you feed lots and lots of hay because they will have lots of hay there to chew. But what you will do is you'll increase the passage rate of that hay through their gastrointestinal tract. So forage, pastures and hays need to sit in the horse's hindgut for a long time. I think it's like more than 70 hours that forages will sit in there being fermented, because the fermentation of fibre is a really slow process. So the bacteria and fungi need quite a lot of time for them to actually be able to cut up the fibre and turn it into those volatile fatty acid compounds that then your horse absorbs and uses for energy. If you feed lots of hay, so if you feed more than 3% body weight of hay per day, and this is through my observation that I think it's around that 3% body weight of hay per day that this will start happening. So again, if for a 500 kilogram horse, that's more than 15 kilograms or more than 33 pounds. if you speak in pounds per day, what you do is you speed up the passage rate of that hay going through the gastrointestinal tract. So feed moves through your horse's gut pretty much at the same rate that they're eating it. So if you're feeding a 500 kilogram horse 10 kilograms of hay per day, that's 2% of their body weight. If you were feeding them 20 kilograms of hay per day, so the best part of a full small square bale, that's 4% of their body weight. And essentially what that is going to do is make that hay move twice as fast through your horse's gastrointestinal tract than what it would move if you were feeding them the 2% of their body weight, which gives the bacteria and the fungi half as long to do the process of fibre digestion in their hindgut, and they will extract proportionally less energy from the hay than they would if you were feeding a smaller amount of hay and giving them much more time to do the fermentation. So the main problem with feeding too much hay is that it's expensive. So your horse is not extracting enough, is not extracting the full amount of energy that it could extract out of that hay that you're feeding, and you're essentially wasting lots of the hay that you're feeding, and it is too expensive at the moment to go wasting. Of course, for easy keeper horses, you'll find if you feed that amount of hay, they will get very, very fat. And we'll talk a little bit more about easy keepers at the moment. And for poor doers, I have had a number of cases over the years where there was a horse that was struggling to put on weight, and the horse's owner was doing the intuitive thing and feeding lots and lots of hay. And then I come along and tell them to do something completely counterintuitive and to reduce the amount of hay that they're feeding. But my purpose for doing that is to allow the hay that they are feeding to actually sit for a longer period of time in the hindgut so that it can be fully digested and the horse can fully extract the energy that hay contains. And as long as there's no other health issues going on, it is a really, really effective way to get a poor doer or a hard keeper to put on weight when the diet that they're not holding weight on has a lot more hay than what they need. So if you are feeding massive amounts of hay and your horse is not maintaining its body weight, have a proper look at the diet and see if you can reduce the amount of hay to allow the horse to do a better job of digesting the hay that you are feeding. There's lots of numbers and lots of percent body weights and lots of daily amounts of hay that you need to keep track of here. But the My Happy Horse virtual nutritionist is designed, this is one of its primary purposes, is to make sure that you are feeding enough forage to your horses without feeding too much forage to your horses. And the very first part of the diet results that everyone can see, even without a paid subscription, is the total feed intake for your horse and then the total forage intake for your horse. So it'll show you very clearly the weight of hay combined with pasture if your horse also has pasture. So it'll show you the combined weight of the forage that your horse is eating. And it will show you on a very easy to read dial that has, red for not enough and green for enough forage. It will show you really, really simply whether your horse is getting enough hay or not. So it's great. Don't go turning yourself in knots trying to do all the numbers and remember all the numbers. This is exactly what we've designed this app to do, is to make sure that horses are getting enough forage. And then, of course, you can look at the rest of the diet and, the amount of protein and all the different vitamins and minerals and mineral ratios. But the first and most important part of the diet analysis that it does is this horse getting enough feed in total, and is it getting enough forage to provide all the benefits that forage provides and also avoid all the problems that diets that are too low in forage will cause. If you have pasture and you're listening to this and you're thinking, oh, well, how much hay do you have to feed if your horses have already got pasture? Let your horse sort of be the judge of that. So your horse will either lose weight or gain weight if they're getting enough pasture or too much pasture. And it's almost a feel thing. And of course, putting your horse's diet into My Happy Horse will also show you if your horse is getting enough pasture or whether the horse needs hay, because you can specify if your horse's pasture is overgrazed at about 3 or 4 different levels of overgrazing. So starting with a bit overgrazed right through to severely overgrazed. And then you'll be able to see estimates of pasture intake and then whether you need to add hay to that diet and how much hay you need to add. So it does become much more complicated when pasture is involved. But again, this is why we built My Happy Horse to help you be able to see, I guess, really clearly whether your horse needs hay and then how much hay your horse needs when you've also got access to at least some pasture. It is important if your horse is just receiving hay. So if they're yarded or stabled or on dry lot and they're completely reliant on you for their forage, it is really important that you weigh your hay. So all different types of hay and even different cuts of hay will weigh slightly different amounts. So a biscuit or a flake, there's lots and lots of different names for a piece of hay, a slab. Depending on the type of hay and depending on who's made the hay, it will weigh a different amount. So I want to emphasize that it's super important that you weigh your hay if your horse is completely reliant on you for their hay supply. The easiest way I've found to do this is grab a hay net and put your hay in the hay net and then get yourself a pair of luggage scales. You can get them online for very little money. I'm going to say less than $10. I think I've seen them for online. So they're cheap to buy. You can also buy them at luggage shops if you want to go and get one from a luggage shop, and just weigh the hay and check and make sure that you are actually feeding the amount of hay you think you're feeding and that you're not overfeeding hay. Because if you're overfeeding hay, you might be able to reduce the amount of hay that you're feeding and get better digestion and have your horse do a little better. I will often find that when horse owners are struggling to put weight on their horses, it will come back to that horse just not getting enough forage. So if you do have a horse that you're struggling to put weight on, go and grab yourself a set of luggage scales, weigh the amount of hay you're feeding and put it all through My Happy Horse to make sure that you are actually feeding enough hay and enough feed in total in a 24-hour period. There's one little class of horse that gets really, really tricky when we talk about the amount of hay to feed per day, and that is the good doer, the easy keeper, the overweight pony, the overweight horse. Because often where our mind goes when we're trying to get these horses to lose weight is to feed less hay. But if you simply feed less hay, you're going to put that horse at increased risk of colic, increased risk of gastric ulcers and behavioural problems, and you'll cause psychological stress and leaky gut. There's lots of reasons why the way to have them lose weight is don't reduce the quantity of hay you're giving them, reduce the quality of hay you're giving them. So if you can feed them a higher quantity of a lower quality hay, that's so much better for them because they'll still have the right quantity of hay to keep them busy chewing and salivating. It'll keep their stomach full for much longer periods of a 24-hour day. It will keep their hindgut full. So I'm not a fan at all of reducing the quantity of hay for an easy keeper. What I'd much rather see you do is go and find really low quality hay, so very stemmy grass hay that, was cut and baled at a very late stage of maturity, or incorporate straw into those horses' diets. There's some really nice research showing that you can feed up to 50% of a horse's diet as straw. And in unrugged ponies over winter, in the particular study I'm thinking about, it did lead to weight loss. So it's brilliant because you can have forage in front of them all of the time. It doesn't taste very nice, I don't imagine, straw. It looks a little bit like eating cardboard. And so they don't tend to go and just eat it because it's there and because it tastes good. But they will go and chew on it when they need something to chew on. So it's a brilliant way to increase the amount of hay you're feeding each day, and it will allow you to feed that 2 to 3% in body weight of hay per day. Your pony will be super happy with you because you're not starving them. You're not giving them, when you're only giving them that 1.5% in body weight per day, it's such a tiny amount of hay, and it leaves them with so much of the day, no matter how good you are at using slow feeding hay nets and various other slow feeding tools, doesn't matter how good you are at using those, you're still going to end up with a pony that has no hay for significant periods of time over a 24-hour period when you reduce the quantity of hay you feed. So go looking for really low quality hay. And then you can feed large amounts of it and keep that pony chewing, keep their hind gut full to reduce colic risk, keep their stomach full to reduce gastric ulcer risk, and just keep them happy because they're chewing, and they really are wired to chew through many millions of years of evolution. That's what they do with their day. They find food and they chew on it, and that is their happy state. I love sitting and watching my horses either graze or eat hay, and you see that droopy sort of look they get in their eyes, and it just looks like a blissful state for them to be in. So the longer you can keep your horses in that state, the happier they will be, and that's the ultimate result, I think, of feeding well for me is that horses are happy. Because when they're happy, they're healthy, and when they're healthy, they will perform well for you, they will breed well for you, they will behave well for you. So they're just beautiful animals to be around when they're happy. I do just want to make a point of saying that if you do use straw or very low quality hay for an easy keeper to have them lose weight, you must make sure that diet is well balanced, because a lot of, straw certainly, and then any hay that is poor quality is a really poor quality source of other nutrients. So be relatively low in a lot of the minerals and will have either really low or zero content of vitamins. So if you put a pony on, say, 50% straw and then 50% very low quality, let's say teff hay, Rhodes grass hay, try and keep as much hay variety in their diet still as you can. But if you have them on all low quality hays, you might have a near zero vitamin E intake, and then that will have flow-on effects for their muscle health and their immune system, lots and lots of negative effects if they become vitamin E deficient, and that's just one example. If they become high-quality protein deficient, then it will put them at risk of having hoof problems or gut health problems because they can't produce the mucus that they use in their gut to protect their own gut from various things. So you've really got to be on top of making sure the diet is balanced. Again, this is what the My Happy Horse virtual nutritionist is designed to do. You can put in for a pony's diet that you are feeding very low quality straws and hays, and it will make sure that you are then meeting your horse's protein, amino acid, and vitamin and mineral requirements. So that, I think, covers how much hay does my horse need. The short answer I could have done for a very, very short podcast is just lots. Horses eat a lot, and I think that is what catches a lot of horse owners off guard. If you are now questioning how much hay you are feeding and whether it is enough, please do go and grab a hay net and some luggage scales and weigh it to confirm that you are feeding between 1.5% and 3% of their body weight, and ideally 2 to 3% of their body weight in hay per day. If you're not feeding that much, then increasing the amount you feed, I can guarantee you, will have flow-on health effects, both physical health effects and mental health effects for your horse. It's such an important part of nutrition, and thank you for still being here and listening right to the end. Please share this episode with any horse owner that you know, because it is a really, really important one for everyone to understand, and it would make me really happy to know that lots more horse owners have got this information and can all be making sure that their horses are getting fed enough hay. Thank you so much for listening, and I will catch you next time. If you'd like to know more about the My Happy Horse virtual equine nutritionist, you can head on over to myhappy.horse. And also, while you're there, check out the Dr. Nerida AI, which is me in AI format. And that version of me is happy to answer your questions about horse nutrition 24/7. Thanks again, and we'll catch you soon.